Hi everyone, welcome to our last module for this course. We're going to look at feminism. Let me put the slides up and we'll go through it. One thing you'll notice, and I guess I have slides on this, so I won't dwell on it too much now, but you'll hear me say things like, feminism, it's probably not a mainstream international relations theory. The ones that we've studied up to now mostly probably are mainstream international relations theories. Probably realism and liberalism constitute the bulk of the sort of center of study in international relations. What I mean by that is like many of the sort of big names, right? Many of the big contributors, I suppose, to international relations theory in journals and at the big research universities. The likelihood is that they have some acceptance of parts of those theories or all of one of realism or liberalism. Maybe there's some constructivists out there too. That's maybe a bridge between sort of the mainstream, the center of the discipline, and the edges of the discipline. Feminism for sure is on the edges of the discipline, and we'll talk more about what that means when it comes up in the slides. But let me share my screen first. Okay. Oops, didn't mean to do that. All right, let's take the slideshow. So we're going to focus on Antigone and on this first. I don't think I assigned any of her work, but if you read any Antigone, that would be very much a useful introduction to feminism. Antigone is the founder probably of feminism in international relations, and this lecture in part is the story of that sort of founding of feminism. Where does it come from? What's it trying to do? And then the rest of the lectures that we have will focus on Cynthia Enlow's work in feminism in international relations. So Antigone. So Antigone talks about her class in the 1980s when she very first starts teaching. She's teaching at a liberal arts college, and she realizes that she's teaching international relations to undergraduate students. And she notices that there's a heavy emphasis in her classes on security issues and nuclear strategy. And what she notices is female students, women would come up to her, women from her classes would come up to her and say, I don't really feel it's cut out to discuss security issues and nuclear strategy as the male students. Maybe this is not for me. And so Antigone was worried about this, right? She, of course, is a woman teaching international relations, a woman in the field, and wondered why her students, women students, didn't feel as included or as qualified, I suppose, to speak about these things. And so she turns to feminism in other fields, in natural sciences, actually, to try and address this and try and understand why women were not feeling as at home in international relations. So that's the sort of story of the where does it come from? One thing Antigone notes is that talking about this concept of the real world, right? This, one response would be like, hey, well, this is really what's happening. It really is about troop movements. It really is about, what new missile technologies are coming out. It really is about nuclear weapons. Like, these are the things that are the threats to global peace. These are the things that win wars, or that these are the things that you can use to psychologically dominate your enemy, right? So if that's what's happening, right, that's real. And so if you don't want to discuss that, if you don't feel qualified to discuss it, well, then you're not qualified. You're not ready for international relations. You're not going to be interested in the field, and so maybe you won't pick another field, because that's what's real. That's what happens in the real world. But Antigone, the response to that is like, well, there's really more than one real world. Feminist scholarship is also taking place in the real world, but it's a different real world than that of states and statesmen. So she's saying, and we haven't quite said this yet about feminism, but we certainly should say it quite soon, right? Is that feminism is as the name probably suggests, right, is looking for the role of, it's probably most interested in the roles of women, right? How do women, and we'll see this with Cynthia Enlow's work, this is certainly where Cynthia Enlow takes it, but there's women in the world and they impact international relations in some ways, and their lives are impacted by it too, right? Remember from constructivism, right, this reciprocal relationship between the agent and the structure, right? That women are sort of created, and their lives and their conditions and their qualities are created by international politics, and they also, in turn, construct international politics, right? And so they might not be in the place that traditional international relations looks. They might not be in big numbers in those areas, right? Especially if you think of the 1980s, right? They might not be in combat roles, right? They might not be the ones, in fact, designing sort of the rocket technology. They might not be the ones that you see at these leadership summits, right? Where where they're hashing out, you know, arms trade, not arms trade, but arms limitation deals, or redrawing boundaries of countries, right? You might not see a lot of women in those places, right? But you know, one is like, you know, they are there, and two, you might not be seeing them, but they're influencing that. But they also might be in other places where international politics is happening that we're not focusing on, right? And that's also real. That's as much real as anything else. It's you know, the summit is as much real as the. I'm probably skipping ahead to Cynthia Enlow, so I'm gonna hold off on that a little bit. But to think about the real world, right? There isn't just one real world. There isn't just one place to look for international politics. There's all sorts of places, and we'll extend that with Cynthia Enlow a little bit. In particular, I mean, the kind of things that we're going to see in feminism is this attempt to construct theory out of the practices of everyday people. We don't have to just look at the statesman. We don't just have to look at, well, and it's funny, right? Because I'm going to say Angela Merkel first. She's the first person that comes to mind, actually. But you know, we don't have to just look at Angela Merkel or Macron. We don't have to look at Putin. Just look at Putin and Biden, you know, and the teams around them, the policymakers around them. We don't just have to look there. You know, the fact is, we do see Angela Merkel, and we'll see later that sort of complicates feminism a little bit, and we'll deal with that. But you know, that's not the only world that international politics is happening. So, Anne Tickner worries that the mainstream perceptions of feminist IR. So what we're looking at is those scholars who might be more realists, who might be more liberals, who might sort of accept some combination of that, or even some constructivists. They might look at feminism and say it's unscientific. You know, looking at the lives of everyday people. There's something about methodology here, right? There's some claim that like feminist scholars are not using proper sort of positivist, objective measures for things. They're looking maybe more at, I don't know. I don't want to join them in the criticisms, right? But there you go. That's one thing. The other thing is, you know, they might think, you know, realists and liberals, they might think, well, okay, it's interesting to bring women into the picture, but you know, that doesn't make it science, right? And it doesn't make it the most important thing to study, right? Just because it's interesting to bring women into the picture doesn't mean it's the most important thing, or the thing that's going to tell us the most about international politics. And so she says, you know, that one thing that they're doing is they're equating gender with women. Now, you know, to be fair, right, to them, it's feminism, right? If it's feminist international relations, right, then you have to think of women to some degree. But as we'll see later on, you know, and I mentioned Angela Merkel, I could mention Margaret Thatcher too, right, who of course was very involved in international diplomacy and some quite serious, you know, war, for example, in the Falkland Islands. She was involved, I think, as I've already mentioned in this class, I think, quite heavily in the negotiations surrounding the end of the Soviet Union. I mean, but the thing is that feminists would say, she might not be the most feminine of women, and that probably doesn't mean exactly what you're hearing right now, but we'll deal with that later on in this lecture. Right? There is a for Anne Tickner, a set of qualities, right, that are feminine, and women might possess these qualities, but women might not possess these qualities. Also, some men might possess these qualities, or maybe many men might possess these feminine qualities. And so, this is the sort of this decoupling of gender and I suppose what's the proper way? I suppose sex, right? Gender is there are certain qualities and attributes that are going to be associated with femininity, and the certain aspects, the certain qualities and attributes that are going to be associated with masculinity. And perhaps you can think about it at this point as something like a stereotype, right? But of course, men don't all fit into one box, and women don't fit into the other box, right? There's some crossover for sure. Anyway, really what we're doing is mainstream perceptions of feminist IR, and the last one really is that, it can tell us a lot about women, but not international politics more generally. So yeah, women are interesting, go ahead and look at them, but that's not really international politics, right? You're not really finding, we want to find laws about war and about, we want to find ways to cooperate, right? For states to cooperate in conflict, in anarchy. It's not that we don't find it interesting, it's just that we don't find it central to the discipline. Right? And that makes it marginal, right? Which it's almost as if I planned this, right? But that makes it marginal. Feminism, it's a perspective from the margins, and Anne Tickner accepts this and sort of embraces this in some way, right? You don't have to be at the center of the discipline. You can be looking in places that other people are not looking at. But there's a blind spot, the center of the discipline, the focus on, statesmen, statescraft, war, the high diplomacy, United Nations, conflict, civil war, terrorism, their focus there, it leaves something unwatched, right? It leaves something for the feminists, right? Something in the margins that the feminists can look at that nobody else is looking at, right? It's a unique approach. And so why not, not everybody has to be a mainstream international relations scholar, right? You can see things that you can't see from the center here, and that's worth seeing, worth looking at. And we'll learn things from that you won't learn by looking at the things that you're looking at. So here's a couple of worries that she has. One is that feminist theory might see women as victims who lack agency. So feminists, she says, you should be careful. So this is the mother, I suppose, of feminism in international relations. Says, be careful here, right? Because we don't want to just focus on the fact that women are underrepresented in, let's say, in the top policy making circles, right? Foreign policy. We can look at, one of the things that feminists might well look at, right, is things like, refugees, right? And sort of this, oftentimes I'll hear the phrase, women and children, right? And that sort of paints women in a sort of in a light that's sort of, well, in a sort of painting a victimhood, I suppose, right? That, like children, that they're unable to look after themselves. They need the military, they need strong men to take care of their interests, right? Because they, women and children are vulnerable. And so, she says, be careful with that, right? Because it's not that women and children, it's not that women, let's just focus on women. It's not that women are not victims of war, but if that's all that they are, that's a worry that she has. So the other worry, I mean, it could follow from that, right? That there's more empowered women, like the feminists, for example, those who are writing international relations theory, they might start to be tempted to speak for more subordinated women. A good example of this, I was at a conference one time, and I ended up at this panel. The panel wasn't all about female genital cutting, but there was a scholar on the panel whose work was on that, and she was talking about how how bad practice it is and how it should be stopped. And I'd never seen, one of the reasons it stands out in my mind, right, is I've never seen a discussant do this before. It's quite a well-known scholar who's the discussant, and I'm not saying anybody's name here. I'm not sure why, but it was a bit of an uncomfortable situation. But he said at the end, like he really went after this scholar about her work on female genital cutting, because he says, you know, this is a practice that many women, it's important to them, and they engage in it willingly, and to sort of paint them as just sort of victims or dupes of you know, of like a patriarchal system. It takes away any sense that they have any agency, right? That they have any sort of decision-making skills, right? And it sort of sets you up as the person that's going to come in and help them to, you know, escape, right? They're just victims, sort of waiting for somebody to come and save them and they don't necessarily themselves know how to live their lives. And so this is a similar worry that Anne Tickner has, though, right, about feminism, is if we have some women in particular, you know, women who are probably in academia, you know, many of them, of course, this is probably changing these days, but, you know, many of them that have traditionally been in, you know, that have a certain socio-economic background, right, have maybe a certain perspective on life, you know, maybe a certain national background in terms of, you know, what societies they might have grown up in. And so, you know, we want to be, Anne Tickner wants to be careful that, you know, we're not speaking for all women here, right? When feminists write, they're not writing on behalf of all women. Yeah, you might be conscious of that. Those are some worries that Anne Tickner has about feminism in international relations. All right, so as promised, this is sort of getting to the sort of meat now of what feminism is about. We've talked about where it's come from. You know, we've talked about some of the sort of how others view feminist scholars and some advantages there maybe, but also some worries. But what is it? What is it? And I think this idea of gender characteristics is at the center of it, as I've already mentioned. Anne Tickner, when she was teaching in the early days, she would do this this activity with her class, right? After she figures out that these women don't feel in the right place in terms of you know, discussing security issues. And so she does this. She says, you know, which words do we associate with masculinity and which words with femininity? When I teach this in person, I do the same thing, right? I feel like Anne Tickner's a decent person to to imitate in my classroom teaching, and so I do it with my students, and I actually don't get the answers. It's interesting. I'm going to show you the answers that Anne Tickner gives, right? That she says her students give. And we'll talk about them a little bit. And we'll talk about the next part of the activity that she does, or what she says. But you know, I want you, just before we go on to the next slide, have a look at that, and maybe pause this lecture here and write down. It might work better for you, because in a classroom, like, it's, especially nowadays, we're much more sensitive, right, to differences in gender, right, gender articulation, and so I feel like oftentimes, at least last semester, I felt like the students were in some ways inhibited, perhaps, and that affected their answers. You know, it may not be. It may just be that people are these sort of distinctions between masculine and feminine are sort of being a little bit eroded in society, perhaps, and so people are not. You know, the thing that Anne Tickner has picked up on in the past is something that's been sort of eroded, perhaps, now. But anyway, have a look at these and pause the video on your own. Just, you know, write them down in 2 columns, masculine and feminine, you know, and see what you get. I'm now then going to change the slide, and so if you don't want to know the answers, definitely pause it now. Anne Tickner's answers, of course, your answers are your answers. So here we are. This is the sort of answer that Anne Tickner would get and what she would expect, and it's this, right? So, you know, masculinity is associated with power, autonomy, rationality, and agency, whereas the feminine is associated with weakness, dependence, emotions, and passivity for her. So, you know, if you look at those, if that's the answers that the students are thinking, right, then that explains it, right? I mean, if international, you know, remember when we talked about realism, right? It was all about power, right, and rationality. If women who are associating themselves with femininity, right, associating with themselves with like the opposite of all of sort of, you know, the realist conception of states, for example, or what states are up to and how they go about things, then, you know, maybe they don't feel comfortable discussing it. Maybe they do feel it's for the men. As I said, when I did this with my class, actually what I just said there, I need to contradict it a little bit, but I'll do it in a second. Yeah, but when I did it with my class, that this was not the outcome at all. I'm trying to remember some of the words that they used for feminine, but it wasn't a werewolf. They did not use any of those words. It was a bit more like sensitive, I think, and caring, the sorts of words that they used. But anyway, the contradiction is that, well, because I said, well, if the women feel themselves weak, you know, dependent emotions and passivity, if they associate that with their own selves, then they might not feel as confident discussing, you know, power, right, and irrationality in terms of international politics. However, this is not what Antic defines. When she asks, so after she's done this part of the activity, she then says, okay, you know, she writes their answers down like this in a table. These are the answers that she usually gets, she says. And then she says to this class, she says, okay, so which side do you associate yourself with more? And she said, actually, you know, many of almost everybody in the room associate themselves with these masculine traits of power, autonomy, rationality, and agency, and not with the feminine ones, you know, including the women. So, you know, which is maybe perhaps why they're in an international politics class to begin with, perhaps. The thing that gets me about this activity, I think it's interesting. I think if it's these sorts of answers that come out of it, then that's quite interesting indeed. It's also interesting that you know, women would associate themselves more with traits that they themselves have said are masculine. That's interesting. But you know, the thing that gets me is when we got to Cynthia Enloe, we might not see, you know, we probably wouldn't see the women portrayed in this way, right? We probably wouldn't see them studied as if they were, right, passive and weak and dependent and full of emotion. And so I'm not sure exactly how much this definition of the feminine, this particular one that Antic defines in their students, I'm not sure how it informs modern feminism, but anyway, the importance of this for you as a student of international relations interested in feminist international relations is to say, well, you know, gender, you know, not all women are associated with the traits that are associated. Not all women associate themselves. In fact, maybe perhaps few women associate themselves with the traits that they also themselves associate with femininity, right? And so it's not as simple as like women versus men, or we should have more women in politics, right? Because of course, some women, perhaps many women, right, would be feel more associated with the masculine traits, right? Anyway, we'll talk a little bit more about this. We have this thing called out of that comes this idea of hegemonic masculinity that Antiqua talks about. It says, look, you know, people think feminism is about women, but it's also about men, right? There isn't only one way to be masculine, right? Despite the fact that we just identified some of the traits that are associated with masculinity, right? But those traits on the last page, that's sort of a hegemonic masculinity. That's what people think that men should be, right? That masculine is, right? And so then, you know, you've got these values, right, that you're trying to live up to, and perhaps you're not fooling anybody, right? Perhaps in terms of those values, and then as a man, and so that's sort of creates, because that's the sort of dominant form of masculinity, right? That might that might create a hierarchy where men who are not those things, right, might be, well, and the thing that, and we'll see this in the coming pages, right, that the men who are not living up to that might themselves be considered sort of feminine, right, which can lead to, well, it's a rhetoric, right, that's used in international politics that we'll see. We have some examples of it on the next slide. So it's these values that are mapped onto states in mainstream IR that legitimates this form of masculinity. So we're looking at these, we can maybe find masculine and feminine states, right? And we might find responses, right, or particular policies that are masculine, right, in terms of hegemonic masculinity, right, that sort of display power or autonomy, right? I mean, think of one of the central features of international politics, right, is sovereignty, right, the ability to act in your own sphere, right, and an associated one is rationality, right, that when you do act, you'll act in a rational way, where you know what your interests are and you're acting in order to achieve those interests, right. That's a masculine trait, right, part of this hegemonic masculinity that Antiquena sees. And so the last one is sort of a small example quickly, and we'll go on to something else, but onto some more examples, I should say. But war in Iraq is a masculine response, right? We're going to go over, if Iraq invades Kuwait, I'm not sure if that's the one she was talking about, or the 2003 version, right, where we go all the way to Baghdad. But there's something masculine about that. There's something about displaying power, using force, rescuing the, at least in the case of Kuwait, right, rescuing the sort of the defenseless that's been, ravaged by an aggressor. There's a particular kind of masculine idea behind that, right? And so, is there a feminine international relations? Is there a feminine policy response to these things? That's a good question that feminists, I assume, would try and answer. One example that Antiquena gives is Bin Laden. So, a little bit dated, but of course, these theories, they should change quite slowly. Bin Laden, he calls Westerners weak, wimpy, and feminized. Right? So that's that idea of the sort of opposite of powerful, right? Is feminine, right? Which we saw on that list of words. That was Osama bin Laden. Our brothers who fought in Somalia saw wonders about the weakness, feebleness, and cowardliness of the US soldier. Also he criticized the US for having women in the military, right? So it's something in international politics, right, that gender exists in international politics. Gender ideas exist in international politics, and we can find them. And we can, if we're feminists, we can, bring these gender constructions of gender identity, we can bring them sort of into the light and show them. And this is one thing that Antiquena is doing here. No robust response expected of feminized America by Bin Laden. But he also has this idea of Western Crusaders, which is also not that feminine, right? That's perhaps a much more masculine view of the West, right? But that's the point, right? Is that even Bin Laden, who's probably not a feminist, or probably was not a feminist, in the same way that Antiquena is, maybe probably not in any way that we could really understand as being feminist. But even he's using these sort of gendered attacks, right, and gendered images, right, to talk to people about what he's doing and what he wants them to do. So so it's there in international politics, it's there to be seen. Feminization of selected others, right? So this is another place in international politics. I mean, it's actually not really that different from the last slide, right, where Bin Laden's doing it. But I think in the West, she's saying, right, we have this tendency to feminize non-white nations, right? In particular, we have done that, but we didn't do that with the Soviet Union. This is sort of an example that we might want to look after. There's maybe countries in the world that we want to look after, and we think that maybe they're not making the right decisions, and we can go in there and sort them out, and help them to develop properly, right? Make the right decisions. That might be a sort of a masculine feminine thing. And then, but she says, on the other hand, right, with the Soviet Union, we actually didn't feminize them at all. We saw them as, well, as a real threat, but also as like rational actors, right? There's, rationality versus irrationality, right? If we think of any state as irrational, you hear people talk about Iran, right? Iran, they're threatening, they're hysterical, right? Hysteria it's effective. It's look up the root of the word hysteria, right? You'll start to see that it's intimately connected with womanhood, right? So here's Iran, right? They're irrational. They're talking about pushing the Israelis into the sea, and we can't trust them with the bomb because they wouldn't know how to use it properly, right? There's a bit of that's, I think, what Antigone means by feminization. But then we wouldn't do that with the Soviet Union. We see them as, okay, they've got nuclear weapons, but they're rational. They use them strategically, and we can talk to them, and they understand the consequences of their actions, right? So that's the masculine and feminine in international politics. And then finally, I'm going to finish with this because then we're going to go on to Cynthia Enloe in the next lecture. But look, this is not really about women in power for Antigone, not for Cynthia Enloe either. We're not saying, and this would be important in like your essays and things, to be cognizant of this, because in perhaps a popularized general sort of feminism, feminist discourse, we might talk about things like how many women are in parliament, right, in the legislature. And we know that in Northern Europe and Scandinavia there's a lot, and in some countries there's not as many, and we say, well, we should have more women in politics, but for Antigone, that's not quite, that misses the point a little bit, right? It misses the point that you can be a woman and you can espouse sort of a masculine outlook. And so that doesn't really, women might behave very much like men, and when I say very much like men, Antigone would say, well, be careful, right? Because you don't mean all men, right? There's a specific group of men that act in a specific way, right, in accordance with hegemonic masculinity, right? And women could act in that same way as well and be part of that same group. And some men might not act that way and might be outside of that group as much as some women would be. And so that's the key here, right? Don't get too, don't make this too simple where you just say, okay, well, more women in politics, women would do it better, or they would do it differently in a way that would, because it's not just about being a woman, it's about being feminine, I suppose. Although again, I'm still a little bit unsure about to the extent to which Antigone is saying, oh, we need like irrational, weak people, right? I don't think that's what she's saying quite. But I think it's some sort of a, anyway, let's leave it there for now, because I've already gone on for a little bit on this, and we're going to cover many of these same themes in the next few lectures. And when I say that, it's not that they're going to be repetitive, right? I don't think that. We're going to move these on quite a bit with Cynthia Enloe, but we certainly at this point should have laid the groundwork for that. So I'm going to end there.